Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at CSIS for the event that we've titled Creative Disruption, Harnessing Innovation for Strategic Effect. And in a minute, I'll introduce our speaker, Will Roper. But let me just take care of a few administrative details first. Again, thank you for joining us. It's a good crowd. As we do before all of our events, I'll give a little bit of a security announcement. If anything were to come up that was awry and unplanned, that would require us to leave the room, which is very unlikely to happen. But if it did, I'll be your security officer for today's event, and I'll give you directions on where to go. We have two places to evacuate to if that were necessary. One is across the street and down a little bit towards St. Matthew's Church, and then the other is out back towards National Geographic building, and that will let you know if that were necessary which direction we should go. I'm very pleased to have with us today one of the real innovators at the Department of Defense. He has been working hard at a series of problems that he'll talk more about for several years, but not a lot was really known about that until the start of this year when Secretary Carter sort of took the wraps off of the Strategic Capabilities Office and started talking about it. And so talking to us today will be Dr. Will Roper. He is a proud graduate of Georgia Tech and also was a Rhodes Scholar, a very distinguished background, served as chief architect at the Missile Defense Agency, has won numerous awards within the Department of Defense with of particular note, several relating to innovation and innovative ideas, and was tapped to head up the Strategic Capabilities Office a few years ago. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the mission that he has within the department, how it relates to the push that I think a lot of us have been following with great interest towards accessing innovation for the defense mission. And without further ado, Will, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much to CSIS for hosting the event. I'd like to especially thank Kath Hicks, who is watching from home, not feeling very well today, but she was the instigator of this, and I'm very grateful to her. She was one of the first people that I got to talk about the strategic problems that the department's facing when I came into this job, so I really covet her advice and her expertise. I also want to thank Andrew for moderating today. I got to cross paths with him quite frequently when he was in the department, working on doing rapid acquisition. You'll see a big emphasis from the current secretary on doing things quickly, and I'm sure that's something that we're going to discuss today. I've learned in the past that when you go to these events, you really don't want the person who's leading off to give you a very long series of introductory remarks, because most people want to get to their questions and be able to ask the things that are driving them. So I'm going to be very brief and just do about 5 minutes of introductory remarks, really to prime the pump, and maybe to give you some examples from history, which you'd think a technologist I'd be here to talk about the future, and we will. But I want to talk about the future in terms of a new way of doing innovation that was very much alive and well in the department in the past. And so I want to take you back to World War II, towards the end of it. So World War II was a period of revolutionary innovation in military capability, even though the science and technology base underpinning it was relatively static until the creation of the atomic bomb. So in that war, where both sides had comparable capabilities, advantages were gained by imagining new ways of repurposing or integrating capabilities. And some of the results were often game-changing. Some great examples surround the Allies' destruction of the Nazi V-3 supergun. It was designed to finish what the V-1 missile and V-2 rocket had started, bombarding London from occupied France, but with artillery instead. At the time, powder artillery wasn't capable of ranging the required 100 miles, but rather than wait for a new leap-ahead technology, the Nazis reimagined how powder guns could be built, incorporating propellant at multiple locations along the barrel rather than just a single one at the back end. The extra boost made a supergun viable with existing technology, and to protect it, the Nazis constructed a massive underground bunker. So bombing from the air was not an option for the Allies. But both the UK and the US had ingenious responses to this by repurposing two of the stalwart workhorses of the war. For the UK, the heavy bomb; for the US, the heavy bomber. The Brits modified traditional heavy bombs to make them detonate under the ground and created the first bunker busters. The Americans incorporated radio and early television onto a bomber, filled it with explosives, and remotely piloted it from the rear, creating a true progenitor of modern-day drones. It was the British earthquake bomb that ultimately destroyed the V-3 and saved London, but here, 70 years later, superguns, bunker busters, drones are still viable military concepts today. So this back and forth competition that you see, this evolution of the military playbook, is really a struggle for surprise. Both sides are seeking to transcend their predictability and regain the element of surprise for future operations. The resulting confluence is one of strategy, concept development, and tactical employment. And it was fast, it was agile, and continually creative because the surprises at birth were short-lived. Once demonstrated, countermeasures were soon to follow, so the next big thing had to already be in the works. We owe a huge debt to the men and women who won that war, but we also can learn a valuable lesson today about how we can maintain our military dominance in a world where the technology playing field is leveling and accelerating. So we're all aware that our Cold War era leap-ahead technology has been on display in the Middle East for over 20 years of operations and other areas around the world. These are technologies like stealth, satellite navigation, precision weapons. The ability to watch these things, to learn, to copy, and to exploit perceived vulnerabilities have given our adversaries valuable insights for modernizing their own weapons development. Whether you call it anti-access aerial denial or another name, these developments hope to undercut over $1 trillion of past U.S. investment. But buried in their foundation are assumptions about what our systems will and will not do. But if we take inspiration from the story of the V-3, disruptive capabilities can rapidly be achieved with existing systems if we free ourselves from conventional thinking and cumbersome processes. So as you may have heard from Secretaries Carter and Work, my office is partnering with the services to do this kind of innovation, near-term innovation, combining hypersonic projectiles with howitzers to make missile defense superguns, modifying Navy interceptors to destroy enemy ships while defending our own, making unmanned fourth-generation fighters the avatars of manned fifth-generation systems, and many, many more examples. The examples I've just covered, superguns, modified weapons, unconventional drones, sound a lot like a page from World War II. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that we were creative and agile during that period, and we can keep that page of history dog-eared. But we're also writing new pages today. Swarming micro-UAVs, autonomous boats, 3D-printed systems, big data-enabled sensing, and deep learning are just a few things that we're currently investigating and developing in our office. We find exciting possibilities in all facets of the military, period. But not surprisingly, there are a few new challenges that we're going to have to overcome in today's world. The first involves technology origination. In the past, new technologies like the early television and the World War II drone were used on the battlefield before in people's homes. In future, this won't be the case. Though the technology organizations of the department have amazing leap-aheads in store, many technologies that are going to affect national security, like the ubiquitous drones, big data, and deep learning I just mentioned, will be developed by and for commercial markets, which means any military will be able to use them. The Defense Department will have to become fast adapters, vice solely developers of technology to avoid being left behind. I'm sure we're going to discuss that more during questions today. The second challenge involves deterrence. While repurposing systems to win World War II, deterrence was not a consideration by default. For us, it is, and an important one. This means we must choose what surprises to reveal and protect to balance between deterring future conflicts and winning them if necessary. This will be extremely complex multivariate calculus, but we're going to have to master it if we want to live in a future shaped by us and not for us. These challenges are not insignificant, but I have hope that we'll overcome them. I'm hopeful in general because we have non-parallel strengths on our side. We have a highly creative society, a high-tech industrial base, and highly adept military personnel. So like our forebears, it's time to challenge these strengths with MacGyver and Q-like ingenuity, regain a sense of urgency, and remind ourselves that when you have the greatest military on earth, you also have the greatest starting block for military innovation and change. Thanks for listening today, and I look forward to all of your questions. Which one do you prefer, Andrew? Do you prefer one?
Well, Will, thanks for those remarks. I have a few questions to start out with to get the room warm, and then we'll turn the audience loose on you in addition. A lot of the projects, and I know there aren't a huge number that have been talked about publicly, but there are some number that have been talked about publicly, and you referred to the fact that a number of them leverage systems that are already in the inventory or maybe programs of record that we're very close to delivering to do things slightly different than maybe they're doing as a result of the work of your office. And one of the age-old things in Washington that comes up whenever you talk about existing systems is there's always somebody who owns that system. Usually it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and they had a pretty good idea what they wanted it to do. Yeah. So along comes Will Roper and says, I've got a better idea for what that system can do. So how do you deal with that issue? How do you get buy-in from the services when they've made investments and they had a reason to make that investment to say that there's additional value and or maybe greater value to be had doing something different with it?
It's a great question, Andrew. I'd like to say I come in with a new idea rather than a better idea for what to do with them. The best thing about running my office is that I have no requirements. I have a mission, kind of like the guys in World War II, guys and gals had a mission, but it didn't devolve down into DoD 5,000, thousands of numbers on paper that were compliance cases. So all of the ideas that we generate are based on trying to look at a way to regain advantage through some kind of unconventional use of a system. So you can imagine that whenever we pick a system, let's take a specific one. So Standard Missile-6 was one of the very first projects that we did with the Navy. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a very, very capable missile defense interceptor. So it's a missile that's sitting on an Aegis destroyer to be able to defend ships against incoming missiles. So we were looking at the way the world may evolve in the future and said, wouldn't it be great if we could give the Navy more anti-ship capability? This was 4 years ago now. And of course, starting a new missile program is, you've lived this. It's very difficult. It takes time. There's contracting that has to be done. So we asked, well, why can't we do it with Standard Missile-6? And well, it wasn't designed for that. So anytime you propose something new, there are going to be key risks associated with it. And there's the risk of, can the missile find the target? Is it going to be lethal against the target? And what I learned early in this job is there is no way to resolve those risks in a way that a service program manager or service executive is going to believe. And so if you go in and you just try to task them or give them a requirement, you're fighting against a natural impulse of our acquisition system, which is to keep risk down, to keep schedule growth from happening, to keep cost growth from happening. So what we decided to do in SCO is to just not fight that and to rather just be a strategic partner with the services. So if you had to put a tagline to what we do, it's prototyping. So all of the risk reduction, let's take a missile, let's modify it, let's go out and fly it, let's burn down, we use the term burn down for risk in the department. Let's burn down each one of those risks so that in the end, it's not a risky proposal. It's something that a service can decide to go buy or not buy. So that's what we did with Standard Missile-6. Key thing for SCO, and I've never really been able to get the media to pick this up the way I've wanted to, is that we could never succeed without service buy-in. And I'm sure for all of you who are experts in department business, you'd realize that. There's no way I can go repurpose a missile. or stick micro UAVs on a tactical aircraft unless that service believes in it. But the key is to not put them in a position where they have to accept risk that's beyond what a traditional program of record wants to accept. And so we become the partner that says, all right, whatever it is you're worried about, we'll fund it until you're not worried about it. In the case of SM6, we didn't have to do formal transition agreements. We didn't have to nail it down and sign in blood. I was having to slow the Navy down. I was like, but I want to do a few more tests, and they took it and ran. And it's fielding now. So something that's really important is that if we partner, the way that we did partnership in the wars, the way that we did partnerships in the Cold War, amazing things are possible. When we try to do a lot of oversight, it tends to put people in an antagonistic relationship, and that slows down innovation. You don't think great thoughts with someone who may knock your legs out from under you in the room.
Well, that certainly parallels the experience we had in rapid acquisition in the wars, where the services really generated the output, and they bought into the requirements. In mostly cases, they funded them. But the mission, if you will, that you talked about, which it's hard to get away from that requirement word because the system is so engineered towards it. It's how budget flows. It's how the system organizes itself. That is what kind of gets the system moving.
I was asked at least, I'm going to estimate at least 500 times during the first year, where's your requirement? And I was like, isn't our requirement naval power? That's a requirement. Projection of power is a requirement. When you try to take that kind of mission level objective, right, and then there's specific problems, so mission and then there are problems underneath it, which is I can't project power as well as I would like versus that system. Right, now you've gotten down to the point that you could take an objective that is more abstract and you can make it concrete. You can put numbers to it. Where we often trip ourselves up is we write down numbers that we wish were true. So this is our forecasting. We write down we'd like a probability of kill of pick a number, a range of pick a number. But then once they take on the word requirement, it means that they have to be. And the function that is so desperately needed in the department is an architecture function. So architecting is really about trading things back and forth. Well, maybe the range isn't exactly where I want it to be. Can I trade something in the rest of the system to get it back? Or maybe I'm designing to such an extreme point that it's blowing my cost and it's blowing my schedule up. So when you don't have any requirements, and we don't in SCO, everything's tradable. And the only thing I owe the secretary at the end of the day is, here's an idea, here's what it costs, and here's how fast it'll go, and here's what it gets you. And then just like all of us do in our personal lives, that's how we buy things for the most part. I mean, what is not tradable? There are very few things. So everything is a benefit versus cost calculus. And so I think we found in the Strategic Capabilities Office that allows you to have design space that a very rigid, overly defined acquisition environment may not allow you to have.
Did you find, you talked about solving problems and architecting to solve problems as opposed to coming up with sort of these rigid numerical requirements. Did you find, or have you found, that there's a lot of consensus on what the problems are? I'll give you, over on our side here in the policy world at CSIS, we've been looking at Goldwater-Nichols reform, and one of the things that's interesting about it is the problem statement is awfully hard to form consensus around. But do you find that the problems that your office is trying to tackle, that when you go to a service and said, here's the problem we think can be solved, that they say, yeah, that's a problem I have too, I want to solve that with you? Or is it something where that takes an extended period of time to get to some consensus on the problem?
As you know, Andrew, it really varies based on the mission and then how risky the idea is. Early on, I would say we encountered a lot more friction because we were unknown. This thing running around in the department, crying for change and speed. Where I think we are now, 4 years later, we'll be in, I think, August 8th, we'll cross 4 years of the office being in existence. The door is open now with the services. Why wouldn't it be, right? Because we're going to bring funding to go do something cool with something that they have. Or there's no, and if it succeeds, it's going to benefit whoever those people are in the program office that day. So we've architected our relationship, the human side of the equation, so that the door stays open. I would say we still encounter just as much skepticism today because there's an ingrained thinking about how a system will and won't work. That's fine, though. That's what the prototyping is for, is to be able to take the skepticism that is all theoretical in our thought process and in modeling in SIM, and to give it a proving ground in the real world. And not everything works, and that's fine. I mean, we talk about embracing success, but we don't really have a good place in the development process currently for failure to happen. You know, S&T is all about pushing something up from the bottom, and a big program of record is really about maintaining cost and schedule over the long term. So where in these two places do you expect to have that system-level failure to occur? Well, it normally occurs in that prototyping step, and that's an area that the department has underemphasized over the last 10 to 15 years. And what you're seeing, you know, under current leadership from the Secretary is a lot of prototyping coming back, because it's a step that was really important for us in the Cold War for keeping up with Russia. So think back to the X-plane programs, right? We did amazing things during that, rapidly. Pushed the technology even when we weren't going to acquire the system. But that emphasis hasn't been as present for high-end military systems in the fight against terrorism and specifically against ISIL. And of course, that's not going away, but the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary have realized we've got to get a strategic balance again in the budget. And so you're seeing organizations like us pop up trying to champion the higher end of warfighting.
So how do you come up with the great ideas? Is it that you've got a staff of geniuses in your team that's coming up with all this? Are you gathering input from others? How does it work?
It's probably the most common question, Andrew. I'll never divulge that there's a magic 8-ball that I have, and I will never give it up to anyone. It's a hard thing. I'm asked by the Hill and the service leadership, how do we do what you do? Industry asks quite a bit, and it's hard. I don't want to just say it's difficult, so I'll try to give you some of the things that I think drive good ideas, but ultimately know my answer is that you don't really create a path for good ideas. What you can and can't do is decide how many obstacles you're going to create in the way of good ideas. So first and foremost, you've got to have the right people. Right? There's no substitute for creative people, and I'm very, very fortunate to have extremely clever problem solvers in SCO. One of our secrets is that no one is the world's expert in anything, but they're people who can work with the world's experts, understand what's important and what's not, and they see the problem in all of its variables. That's really what I'm looking for when I interview someone. Do they try to subdivide the problem and say, well, I'm not a whatever kind of person. I just want to talk about the electronic warfare aspect of it. When you're down in that stovepipe, you're not architecting anymore. So I look for people who stay up at the full space levels. So finding the right people for the problem is important. Culture is important, and that's an area we're going to have to do a lot of work, is getting a bunch of people to believe not only they can solve a problem, but believing if they do, that problem, they really will go change the world. Their answer will go out and be fielded is very difficult. And a lot of what I think is affecting the department right now is when things are slow and programs start and stop and sequestration puts things in and out, you can get a feeling that, wow, we can do the greatest work, but it's going to be the greatest work inside our own space. So culture, people thinking if they go light the world on fire, it'll continue to burn, is important. And then 3, process. And process is the least hard for me. You want to give people a lot of creative freedom up front. Give me your, I usually don't ask them for typical, I don't use DoD terms. I don't ask for evaluations of alternatives or not. I ask them just give me their business case. What is it you want to do? Why do you want to do it? Give me the strategic context, and then tell me why you think it's practical. That they also have to understand things like legalities and how does it affect international balance. And really force people to do a lot of net assessment. And then you cut them loose, and you give them a lot of ability to fail. And if you don't give them that, and if the first time they fail, if they're punished or if there's a backlash from it, you'll go back and affect the culture. So you've got to give them a lot of upfront freedom, but not too much. Right? That upfront freedom has to have a known, understood goal line, which we have as part of our process, where, all right, you've had your time to go do analysis, thinking, prototyping with a little p. Now prove to me it's time to go do a large effort with the services. And that's the point where we expect the success rate to go up, but not be perfect. So those are the three things I've found, is that understanding, getting the right people, creating the culture, and then making sure that the process gives freedom to fail, but they're understood goal lines, or else you just have people running around. They can meander for years, and we've had programs in the past in the department do that.
You talked a little bit about the fact that that there's a value to prototyping even for systems that you don't field. In fact, maybe because you're doing things that you don't necessarily intend to field, you can reduce risk, you can explore areas that would be impossible to do if you knew you had to field a solution at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But that raises the issue of how do you measure success? If success isn't gear in the hands of the warfighter, which was kind of the rapid acquisition metric, how do you know that what you're doing is giving the department value for the dollar?
It's, I think, one of the most important questions for ultimately gearing up for a long-term competition. So like your outfit, Andrew, we have judged ourselves for our first 4 years based on programs of record created or augmented. So if we're not fielding it, it doesn't count on our scorecard. That's always going to be important. Mm-hmm. And I think we should anytime anyone comes in with something we can field and give advantage, we ought to do everything we can to get out of their way to get the capability fielded. The industrial base is important too. And I often remind people that the acquisition, I asked a lot about, because we're doing things quickly, and we have the benefit of using existing systems. So if we weren't doing things quickly, then I ought to be fired because we have a lot of advantages that development doesn't. But the acquisition process, it does work. A lot of people will just say it's broken, and that's not actually, I think, what they mean. They mean it's too slow. So you can't say the acquisition process is broken in one breath, and then the next breath say, and we have the greatest military on earth, right? We do. Everyone wants to use the systems that we have. No one is looking to go outsource military development to other nations. We do it very well. But the way we do it is, like the examples that I mentioned earlier, it's a thing of the past. And now we live in a world where we can't wait 10 years to get a program right ultimately, because outside technology, commercial technology is driving things. So the world that we live in now, there is a time constant that we need to do development, which is now much shorter than traditional acquisition. And what we're striving to find is a way to speed things up. So this is one way to be able to do that. But you can imagine that even if we start using a lot more commercial technology, if we find ways to speed things up, there are still going to be things, military systems, that only the U.S. military is going to be buying. So nuclear submarines and fighters and things like this. So keeping those industrial bases alive and sharp is going to be critically important. And depending on the guidance that we're given in future, it's an area I'd like to see us start growing in SCO, where we start targeting a strategic capability that we're not ready to buy. But like we did in the X-plane business, we go out and we try to get that next technology leap ahead in. And if we succeed, maybe we do buy it. We've done that a couple of times in the past. But if we fail, then we've got lessons learned that don't roll into a future program. And I think we've got a lot of good lessons learned from the past so that we're not starting from scratch about what works and what doesn't.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open up to audience questions. And I appreciate your staying with us for the full hour. So there's a number of proposals out there right now on the Hill for various acquisition reforms, most of which I would argue are related to exactly the issues that you've been talking about this morning. How to identify greater innovation, how to organize to get capability through the system faster, how to enable the ability to take more risk and to potentially fail, and if you fail, fail fast, don't fail slow and costly. And all of these proposals, I think, have kind of their pros and cons, and have written about some of them. But I'd just be interested in any observations you have about this push that's out there and things from the experience of the SCO that would indicate where some of the more fruitful avenues might be.
No, I think there is a difference of opinion between the Secretary and members of Congress on how to organize for innovation. But what I think is important is everyone seems to be in agreement that we have to innovate again. You've got a Secretary of Defense with an unusual background, a technical background who understands technology and is doing everything in his power to get technology, but technology that's going to field spun up in the department. I think you're seeing from members of Congress the same kind of desire for the building to move quickly again. So that I think that's hopeful for us, is that at least in what we want, there's agreement. In how we do it, there's not. I put the most thought into is there a way that we can take a next step on doing more rapid development? And I've alluded to a little bit of the things that I've concluded in this discussion. I think if we could modernize our concept of requirements, I think we would do the most good. To me, and I'm not your normal bread and butter acquisition person, but to me a requirement is something it's a number that you can't negotiate. So, and there will be systems that have requirements. We probably don't want to build a second-rate nuclear submarine. We don't want to take shortcuts with safety. We're going to have national-level programs that are important for deterrence that we have to get right. And they will have requirements. And I think our acquisition process gets those things right eventually. And there's one body of effort, which is when we have to build to compliance, how do we have best business practices there? But I'm not sure that the majority of our programs are going to be laden with requirements. I think most of them are going to be under mission and objectives, where you have measures of effectiveness, but no one number is not on the table for discussion. Will we build missile programs in future where someone says it's got to go 500, pick a unit, and if someone comes in, a good engineer comes in and says, if you let me go 480, I can drop your cost, or I can get it on a different asset. I can get it on more assets than would normally be able to carry it. We want people to look for those solutions. We want to be able to have families of solutions that trade across the variables, and I think what we'll mainly care about is what do they cost and how fast do they go. And if you think about that, that naturally ties to prototyping. If you have a lot of different design cases, some risky, some not, you'd really like to go try them out before you buy them. So I see in the work that's being done, in the sort of better buying power, get acquisition better, and the whole horse trading business of architecture, the piece parts of being able to speed things up. And my hope is that in future years that we'll continue to have support from all areas of the government to let us keep experimenting with 21st century development and acquisition until we find a formula that really works. My biggest fear is that when things don't work, that this sense of urgency that we discussed earlier in the World War II examples, that was an amazing time. There was a can-do attitude, a must-do attitude, rapid turn, ability to fail in the interim as long as we succeed ultimately. I think if we could bring back a little bit of that spirit and pump it in to various parts of the department, it would leaven everything. So I have hope looking at the past. We just have to navigate the future.
Well, let me open up at this point to the audience. We have a full house today, and I note some distinguished faces in our audience too. So we'll start here in the front row. And folks will bring mics to you. Please let us know who you are, and please also restrain yourself to one question.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. Dr. Roper, you and Secretary Carter have spoken about the Arsenal plane. Can you tell us what legacy platform that is going to be based on, and do you see that as a follow-on or substitute for the A-10 once that platform is retired?
So I'm asked a lot about Arsenal plane. If the Secretary has not told the world what the Arsenal plane is, I will not be telling the world what the Arsenal plane is. I'm happy to just remind people what we're hoping to do is experiment with the concept of an off-board platform supporting a forward one. So if you're familiar with the way that the Navy fights with naval integrated fire control, the Navy was forced in the past to kind of get sensors and shooters separated, and missile defense has taken that a step forward as well. I think we're in a place now where that's a potential CONOPS, or concept of operation from the air. And so we're very interested in seeing if legacy systems can play the role of the big workhorse carrying payloads and weapons into the fight. And without breaking an arm and a leg, can we get these networked with forward systems? But we want to it could be a completely game-changing ConOps if we get it right. It's also a risky prototyping effort, which is why it's prototyping. So we want to give ourselves maximum chance to look at various options before we neck down and say, here's what it is. But it's a great example of something that we probably would have spent a long time thinking about. If we wanted to start an arsenal plane program, how long would it have taken us to pull the trigger on that after all the analysis and evaluation? And instead, we go from having the idea to having the prototyping effort started in a year. And even a year is too long. I think we have to get faster than that, but that's a big step for us. So bear with us on the concept itself, but know that our intentions are to give ourselves the maximum set of choices to get it right.
I'm going to kind of bounce around the room. Why don't we go on the row here?
Hi, Mark Pomerleau with C4ISRnet. I was just wondering if you could explain what's in the pipeline for unmanned ground systems and what the challenges in the field driving that need is.
Great question. So our big emphasis this past year was upping our work with the Army. And I love working with all the services. They all have different cultures. I love working with the Army and the Marine Corps because they move quickly once they decide to move. Our main work in ground vehicles is quite exciting. There's a lot of great science and technology on unmanned ground vehicles that can go anywhere. But you're all reading in the newspaper, what's the commercial world working on? Ground vehicles that can navigate roads. And so we've taken a very hard look with the Army on what's the mission impact if we use commercial style unmanned ground vehicles, given that they're not going to go off-road, but do we get a good enough solution to get moving? And when I say good enough, a lot of times people think, that means that it's not what we ultimately want, but it's better than waiting for it. And really what it to me usually means it's good enough to get started because I see the improvement pipeline behind it, right? Unmanned ground vehicles that are going to go around, that we're going to maybe one day be driving around in, that's a technology push that's going to be updated many, many times by the commercial world. And wouldn't it be smart to get the Army and the Marines into that now so that aside from just having the system, that they've got people who are trained to use it, that know how to analyze the impact, they've thought through what missions they can do. So I have a due back to Army leadership on what we found, and my hope is that we will find a sweet spot for saying, let's go out and start working with existing technology, and that when future technologies allow us to go off-road mature, we'll already have experience in the pipeline.
In the back, next to.
Hi, Mr. Roper. Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg News. Can you talk about the budget outlook for your office, given the big spike in 17, then it drops off through 2021? It's not the greatest ingredient for survival, given a new administration. Why the spike, and why not stable funding through the FIDB?
It's thus far. So let me talk about the spike. So we'll be depending on how the final budget shakes out. We should be sitting around 900 million or so. That's a pretty meteoric rise in the department. So that's not really due to me. I always remind people that the fact that SM-6 worked as an anti-ship weapon, it has nothing to do with me, right? It was the missile that was capable of doing it. I was just willing to take a little risk to find it out. But the fact that we've had that rise is really due to great partnerships with the services. More doors are open. And in fact, a lot of times people will come into our doors saying, I know what you do and I have an idea. And so we're getting good ideas from the services now. You may have seen in the budget, there's a maritime Tomahawk capability. We worked on that with the Navy. That was the Navy coming to us and saying, we have an idea. I said, it's a great idea. What can I help you with? And they wanted some help doing the analysis and mission set. So that's one reason we've grown. Second reason is very good support from the Hill. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of champions for defense innovation there, and they have supported the way that we do things. That's why you've seen us pretty much double in budget each year. In terms of how the out year goes, I guess that'll be an interesting question for future. Like right now, SCO is funded based on projects. And what I mean by that is a lot of people ask me, how do I decide what to fund? I don't. I have a $60 million a year flatline budget. That's what we run the office with. That's what we do analysis with. That's what we do low-level testing with. The other $840 million are all concepts. They're proposals. They're pitches to the department in the budget cycle that have been individually funded. So the downside to that is, right, is that there's not this stability in the out year. The upside to that is we have to be urgent every year. It's not going to make SCO go away if I don't do any work this year, if I dial it in. But in the out years, if I'm not putting new concepts in, then eventually we evaporate and go away. There's a part of me that thinks that's a really interesting model to experiment with, creating more of a business-like approach, an urgency approach. For the folks of mine that are here in the audience, they know that right now we are focused, laser focused on the 18 budget because we know it's critical for our future. So right now I like the fact that urgency seems to keep our blade sharp and going and looking for things. And whatever happens in the future, we'll try to be ready for whatever future leadership want us to do. My hope is that the quality of the ideas, the buy-in from the services, and the speed at which we're going, and the relatively low cost of the ideas are what will help us when new leadership come in.
Let's come back up to the front here, on the right.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense.
Sydney.
Double-bladed question. I mean, looking at your successes so far, the things that you're excited about, are there common themes, particular technologies or mission areas that are more receptive to this approach? I imagine, for example, building large hunks of metal in shipyards, probably not where you're prepared to evangelize. Conversely, when you look at your failures, are there interesting common themes from the failures? Because the whole point of this approach is that you actually can learn from those as opposed to having everyone commit seppuku as soon as something goes wrong.
Yeah, so why don't I do failures first, Sydney? That's always good to have good news at the end. So I have not seen a theme to the failures other than, everyone, I've been able to step back from it and say, could I have known what we just discovered before I began? And thus far, the answer's been no. Part of that is doing analysis, right? If you can crunch it in a model, you shouldn't discover it in the real world. But I haven't seen them cluster because like battery technology wasn't good enough or we didn't have a material strong enough. So they're kind of scattershot. The successes, there are some themes. A big theme is teaming. So back to the architecture idea. When you architect things, you put a bunch of things together. You can solve things with a group solution, and that's difficult for our current process to do in the department. But we do a lot of group solutions. This System A doesn't do the job, System B doesn't, but as a team, they can do it decidedly. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone. That's how biology works with specialization, and so we're seeing that as a key thing to look at. So what that tells me, Sydney, is that whenever an idea doesn't work, before I cut it off, I go around and try to find a partner, a team member for it. The second theme that tends to constitute a game changer for me is when we cross a domain. When domains that were heretofore separate are now blurred. So I'm really enjoying working with the Army and the Navy on hypervelocity guns. So that's the electromagnetic railgun program, great technology. But who would have thought we could have fired that projectile out of an existing powder gun to great effect? So it's really interesting because it's blurring domains, especially inside the Army. Now, artillery and missile defense are the same. They may not be the same thing from a doctrine standpoint, though the Army's working on that, but they're the same thing from a system perspective. They're resident in a common system that can do both. So those two things tend to be our biggest leap aheads. There's also a third theme, which is just looking for commercial innovation. Whenever you can find a commercial solution, it tends to be faster, cheaper, and it upgrades itself over time. But the things in the commercial world that we think are very valuable, they're valuable because there's a business case for them, vice that it's a thematic national defense case. But in the drone world, in the big data world, deep learning is extremely fascinating to us. I think there's huge potential for it. So those three areas, when we team things, cross a domain, and then try to bring in a commercial tech that we think will keep upgrading itself.
Okay, just come back to the middle.
Thank you, Robbie Harris here, former naval person. Thank you for being here. Thank you, more importantly, for what you're doing at school. A question or two about the broad area announcement that you released several weeks ago last month. I'm sure there must have been 1,000 or maybe several thousand responses. First question: how are you doing in reviewing those many papers? So far, are there any ahas? What do you see as a path forward? And is the door now closed for other inputs this year?
That's a good question. So one of the nice, so for folks that don't do acquisition, so we have a BAA, or a broad area announcement, that's out, which is kind of an open door to the outside world to bring us ideas. It's one of the nice things about having a public face and an acknowledged mission now, is that during our first few years, we were a relatively classified entity, and it was difficult to go talk to people that didn't have clearances. So we have one out, and we have had a lot of submissions. It's not 1,000, but we may be getting close to that. So we have a great team going through them. Obviously, for any kind of competitive decision, I can't discuss the specifics that I think jump ahead of the others. But what I'm noticing, and I was afraid when we put the BAA out, that I would get the old ideas that I've seen many times that now have like a new label, a new name, a new graphic, but it's the same idea. And there's a little bit of that. But I have seen people put in some things that are different. And there are companies that that haven't really done a lot of work with the government. All of that is exactly what we want. Is we want people who have creative ideas to be able to get to us. So it's not too late. Our plan is to keep that open as a revolving door around the year. The big time for us for ideas is is in the fall, which is why we have it out. So 18 budget will be locked, and then we start immediately working on 19, because as I mentioned earlier, we have to have urgency. We have to generate new ideas in every budget in order to stay around. So if you have an idea, go to FESBID Ops and get it to us. Just search for SCO.
Let me come here.
Al Hemphill from Parsons Corporation. Will, how does modeling and simulation figure in the evaluation of systems and in system architectures with what you're doing?
Heavily. So as I mentioned before, I always ask when something doesn't work, or when I'm going to fund something, when I ask for money to go do something in the physical world, can I do it in a virtual one? And a lot of the technologies that are coming from industry allow different kinds of modeling to be done. I think we do a good job when the inherent phenomenology is based on physics. So rockets, radars, things like this, you can go pull Newton's equations and Maxwell's equations and manifest them. I think we do a good job for that. I think we've got some area to grow for things that aren't based on fundamental laws of physics. So the way information works in the world, hugely impactful. And we are wrestling with how to get our operators, our warfighters, ready to deal with a world of saturating information, most of it coming through open source mechanisms. How do we model that? That is a question we could use help. Cyber is an area, right? It's not like there's the Newton's equations or Einstein's equations that tell you how to calculate cyber. Very much driven by specific results of specific systems. So how do we model that at a, maybe we could do it at a local level. How do we do it at a global level? We need help on. I think the thing that I always encourage our folks to realize is that you can end up modeling something forever, but there's a point that I encourage all people coming into the office to realize is, are what you analyzing, if you get it all right, would you still not be able to convince your service partner? And if the answer is no, just quit modeling. We're going to have to go do that, whatever it is. So we pick and choose between those things that we think are believable and those that we think have to be demonstrated.
I'll come over here to the right.
Hi, Tony Bertuca, Inside Defense. Because the theme of the discussion is disruption, there's typically another word that accompanies that, things become displaced, as sort of another impact. You mentioned the work you're doing on the new hypervelocity powder gun and how it has had really surprising results. This is something that the Deputy Secretary brought up a few months ago. He said when they were building this year's budget that at the beginning they started out thinking it would all be railgun development money, and then the powder gun happened. And they provided enough funding for a next administration to maybe try to put its eggs in two different baskets. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between those two technologies, where you see them going, and where you see displacement occurring, because some programs can become monuments that get disrupted?
It's a good question. So I mean, I think the evolution of our high-speed gun work is a good example of not getting too tied to any individual technology. So if we were here 2 years ago, I would tell you the only way we're going to do missile defense with guns is with electromagnetic railguns. So for those who haven't come across that term, it's just a gun that you're using electromagnetic forces to create. It's a Lorentz force, and what's different about it from a powder gun is you can keep a constant acceleration down the entire length of a barrel. A powder gun, which has some kind of explosive charge, you're getting acceleration all the way down the length of a barrel, but the acceleration amount is going down because the gas, as it expands, is lowering pressure as it fills a bigger volume. So railguns offered the chance to use the length of the barrel as a way to up the velocity. And then we calculated, well, if we can up the velocity, can we go shoot down incoming missiles? Yes. The projectiles coming out of the gun are cheap, much, much cheaper than the missile defense interceptors we use today. So we said, wow, this is a different paradigm of missile defense, and we need to go do it. As we got moving, we got Navy and Army participation, especially their high-speed gun experts, and we realized that we were not pulling all of the tricks that we could pull in the powder gun world. To me, they were just interesting test articles a few years ago. And so thanks to that service input and us funding some kind of high-risk demonstrations, we now think that we can do pretty revolutionary things with existing powder guns. So think howitzers, Paladins, the Navy's 5-inch guns. There's a 5-inch gun on most of the destroyers, so 180, I believe, that are outfielded. So we've shifted emphasis to that, not because we're not interested in railgun. We are. But when you look at the delta between fielding and quantity, we've got over 1,000 powder guns, right? We have very few railguns. So I'm hoping to accelerate that. I'll wring out a lot of the risk in the railgun program because I'm using the same projectile. I'm developing a sensor for it, which wasn't there before, developing the fire control, which is how you make the projectile go where you want it to go. And so when the railgun is then ready to field, it'll be able to just be dropped in place as a better launcher, as opposed to being a great technology that we have to go build a new architecture for. And I have to give kudos. I mean, I have to give great kudos to the work that the services have done. Also, I have to also say that in almost every scope program where the risk is there is a great service laboratory or a DARPA or some technology office that we are taking what they developed and taking it the next step. So the railgun projectile developed by Office of Naval Research, they got it up to a pretty high readiness level of maturity, and now we're going to take the bet on it to say, all right, I understand that. Let's go see if we can field it and completely flip the paradigm of missile defense. I want to make sure people understand we are not disconnected from them. We're kind of a launch platform that can be used once they get a technology over a development milestone.
Let's try the back of the room over here on the right.
Thank you. Jim Hoagland, Washington Post. I wanted to ask you to amplify perhaps a little bit on...
Could you flip the mic around?
Oh,
Sorry, you
right,
got it.
right. Sorry about that.
That's repurposing a system right there.
I was doing that to set you up for that. So I wanted to ask you about big data, which you've mentioned a couple of times, and particularly what are the problems and what are the opportunities and challenges for the military of big data? How do you use it? Perhaps an avenue going into that would be to also look at your comments on dealing with the fact that the technology is being developed today outside of the military, outside of the government, by multinational corporations. What are the problems of dealing with them, and what are the problem resolution methods that you use?
Great question. So big data keeps me awake at night, both from worry and from excitement. Powerful technology, especially when you combine big data with deep learning. They're not the same. They are natural. They will be a potential peanut butter and jelly equivalent of the 21st century, and there's huge impacts for national security. As you mentioned, a lot of it's being developed in the commercial world. Commercial world doesn't use the term operationalize, but we would say in the department, they're operationalizing it. It's getting out into the field and being used. There has been tremendous work in the department, a lot of it done by DARPA and other research labs like AFRL, on developing big data technology, and that will continue into the future. What we're trying to do with big data is come from the other direction. Rather than push the technology, which we think will continue to happen because of commercial uses, we want to come back from the operators. We don't have a big data program today. We don't have operators sitting in front of consoles using it. So we've started one. And believe it or not, it's the Marine Corps that's doing our operations, because they get it. And so what we've decided to take on first was the world of information around us. So we've seen that the old reading newspaper way of keeping up with current events doesn't make sense. We all have apps on our phones that do pretty incredible things to help find articles of import to us. And the marketing world does even greater things in doing kind of real-time sensing, isolating demographics that you may be able to market to or not, and then being able to put that in a visualized setting that allows you to understand your mission and likelihood to succeed. So we've thrown the Marines into that, and what we're trying to get right is the architecture, so meaning we're probably not ever going to develop the Jing big data tool. We're probably going to be using lots of commercial tools well into the future. That's what we currently do. So we're wrapping that with call it middleware, but it allows you to pick and choose what you want to use from these tools. And we're really working on the visualization of it. We want it to be something that stays static for operators, even if all the things under the hood are changing frequently. So Marines are doing a great job on that. The tools have been used during operational exercises with great results. My hope for the future is that as commercial tools mature, as the technology shops of the department continue to do great things and they bring in this magical widget that we want to use, that we'll have the architecture, the framework to drop it into without finishing the technology and then not having all of that infrastructure, training, logistics in place to be able to use it. So still a hypothesis, right? Everything for us is prototyping. But when I look at big data and I look at where the commercial world's going with deep learning, the ability to sort of do intelligent interpretation of unformatted data within it, semantic spaces, that sort of thing, I wouldn't be surprised if in future, if operators who are having to do sensing have tons of autonomous AI support mechanisms, things like Siri and Cortana that are there, that are highly sophisticated and programmed, that are helping make decisions and decision aids because the information is just too quick for operators to understand. One of my biggest fears for the 21st century is the time constant of conflict and war shrinking down so far that people can't get in it. And so the only way we're going to be able to blow it back up is to have intelligent systems, learning systems that can live inside the quick space, make sense of it, and then get decision out to people who can command and control overall, basically take the temperature of the system and determine where it goes in future, rather than be down at the immune system level. And if we're going to get ready for that, we got to start now. So that's why we're all in on it.
Well, I apologize. We have still a number of hands raised, but we have come to the end of our hour. I really appreciate you giving us this time. And please join me in thanking Dr. Roper.